And that's to start getting into the influence and the legacy of Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think there's many horror writers out there that haven't been influenced and haven't read Poe, you know?
Oh man, yeah, he's like the grandfather of the genre in so many ways. You know, there's a direct line from H.P. Lovecraft to Edgar Allan Poe, and then from H.P. Lovecraft to someone like Stephen King, and then from Stephen King to so many modern authors, right? Like, it's just like the lineage is there. They're all connected. Welcome, friends, to episode 288 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss the life of Edgar Allan Poe in his 1839 short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. I feel like this one's truly been a long time in the coming. Like, we talk all the time about that. We're like, oh, we've been waiting on this one. But like, Edgar Allan Poe is such a big name that we have yet to get to. There's been so many adaptations of his work. I'm really excited to get into it here, and we're going to try and do a bunch in this coverage.
Yeah, I personally love Edgar Allan Poe. I think he was one of those top tier authors, I feel like, that you learn about in school, and like, you know, your Shakespeare's, your Poe's, your Mary Shelley, like those types of authors that you read these older materials from that I really connected with. Like, as a teenager in high school, feeling very angsty and emo, Edgar Allan Poe came along and told these like horror stories that were very angsty as well, but also like just were intriguing and kept my interest in ways that like some, you know, of course, like a Frankenstein does, but this I don't know, he just means a lot to me, and kind of as an icon for gothic horror and that kind of stuff in general. I've always respected him and just kind of love his overall vibe.
Absolutely, man. I mean, I'm right there with you as a sad, you know, melancholy, emo youth. I used to love Edgar Allan Poe and read his works. I have this bound Barnes and Noble edition up behind me on the wall that I've had since those years. He's all of that, and then also he is that like well-respected, one of the most famous authors of all time, I think. He is so well renowned. We'll go through his bio on this episode. There's so much interesting stuff to get into there. Just a tragic, just tortured figure who was everything you would imagine from reading his work. That was the man. Like, he lived it. There's so much to get into there. And then we're going to get into the Mike Flanagan adaptation in our following two episodes, where we're going to dive into that. And we looked at the names of the episodes, and a lot of them correlate to short stories from Edgar Allan Poe. And we realized that this was going to kind of be an anthology series that is based off of The Fall of the House of Usher in an overarching way. But in the individual episodes, I assume they're going to be heavily influenced by the reference to short stories. So we're going to save some of those short stories for later. But for this first one, we're going to focus in on a few that I know have like a just an overall influence on it. Obviously, The Fall of the House of Usher, the titular story, but then also the Cask of Amontillado supposedly plays a pretty big role in this. So we're going to talk about that short story, and then of course The Raven, Edgar Allan Poe's probably most famous work of all of them.
Yeah.
So we'll get into that one on this episode as well. So we have a lot of stuff ahead of us.
The Raven and, for some reason, Pit and the Pendulum are two of his like major stories that stand out to me, that I remember.
Okay. See, The Telltale Heart was the one, I think, for me that made an immediate impression.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
There's so many, though. I mean, obviously, The Fall of the House of Usher, super famous. Cask of Amontillado, like so many.
There are the Cask and Fall of the House of Usher I hadn't read before. So it's,
cool.
It's
okay, awesome. Yeah, I think I definitely read Fall of the House of Usher. I think Cask of Amontillado I actually had not read in its entirety, at least. So that was a fun experience. We'll get to those later on. But before we get to any of that, first thing I want to do is congratulate you. You recently went on vacation, and I got the text message letting me know that you and my sister, who you've been dating throughout the entire recording of this podcast, are now engaged. So, yay!
Thank you. Long time coming. We're very excited. You know, it felt like the right time. It was a really amazing trip, and you know, just so happy. So, you know, excited for the future. Got a wedding coming up.
Yeah. So if you're a longtime listener of the podcast, hopefully you're excited for James as well. Let him know if you follow us on social media. Finally, I feel like it's a true coming together. You will be my brother-in-law
Right.
at long last.
It's a lot easier to describe the podcast as brother-in-laws rather than it's my sister's long-term boyfriend, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I'm looking forward to welcoming you to the family officially, man. It's
Yeah.
I'm really happy for you too. So happy to hear all of that. And yeah, I just figured we had to share that with the listeners before we can really move on.
Yeah.
Couple other points I wanted to make before we get into everything. First off, and this is a big one, we are planning to have a guest on our final episode of The Fall of the House of Usher, and that is John Langan, the author of The Fisherman, which won the Bram Stoker Award, I think, in 2016. I'm in the middle of reading that book right now, having a great time with it, and he's an excellent writer. I'm excited to have him on, horror writer, so I thought it would be appropriate to bring someone on like that to help us close out the coverage. And I'm going to be really interested to hear his takes on the show and his takes on Edgar Allan Poe and all of that.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I feel like you can't, and that's to start getting into the influence and the legacy of Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think there's many horror writers out there that haven't been influenced and haven't read Poe, you know?
Oh, man. Yeah, he's like the grandfather of the genre in so many ways. There's a direct line from H.P. Lovecraft to Edgar Allan Poe, and then from H.P. Lovecraft to someone like Stephen King, and then from Stephen King to so many modern authors, right? Like, it's just like the lineage is there. They're all connected.
And with The Fall of the House of Usher being a haunted house story, I couldn't help but think about this story, Fall of the House of Usher, influencing The Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson's work.
Yeah, I mean that's another like one of those branches, right, in the tree of horror. Yeah, I'm not like an expert on all this stuff, but I do like that as we're continuing to hit these icons, it starts like slotting in my mind, like, oh, okay, this is where that came from, and I can see where the influence was.
And
right?
Somebody else who's finally, I mean, of course, I knew the influence was there, so obviously the influence is there, but Neil Gaiman, so inspired by Poe. He feels like a continuation of some of the stuff that Poe is doing in a lot of ways.
I know there's a video of him reading The Raven that he put out one Halloween. He's like in a like candlelit room, and it's you know how good of a reader he is, of course. And then he's doing this rendition of The Raven, and I thought it was excellent. Maybe if I can find that, I'll put it in the show notes as a link. Because that was cool. Yeah, definitely influenced. So many have been. I guess just overall, reading Edgar Allan Poe this time of year, it felt right to me. I was really enjoying this one.
I mean, I was on a cross-country trip. I was in, California, Southern California. We were at Joshua Tree and Sequoia and Yosemite, and then we went over to Big Sur. And the whole time I'm listening to Poe stories, and it's in October. It's cool over there. I think I'll associate this trip and this engagement with Poe in some way too going forward because I was listening to it. And yeah, just I'm excited. It's my favorite time of year. It's just October.
Yeah, it's great.
It's the best time of year. It's the changing of the season, and then it leads into like a nice end of the year with the caveat that most of this stuff is very depressing. But if you can indulge in it in that way, or you can view it as someone experiencing grief that you're reading about too, and I think that's like when I was a teenager, that's what I was latching onto, is I was like,
yeah,
all of the feelings that I couldn't articulate at the time, he was able to, and then in this, I'm just enjoying the artistry. Of course I connect on an emotional level, but just like especially The Raven, like it's so endlessly referenced, and it's so iconic as a work of poetry. And at a time when I was kind of the kind of kid who thought that I wouldn't like poetry, this allowed me, it opened that door for me and got me into poetry.
I agree. It was one of the first poems I probably ever really latched onto and really, really enjoyed. We will get into that one. It has an interesting legacy, history behind it. All of that stuff we'll get into when we get to The Raven. But first, we got to talk about the man's life, because I think that will give us context for everything we're about to read and throughout this coverage. As we go into the stories and compare them to what Mike Flanagan is doing on the show, I think it's important to have the context in which these were written in, and the context of his life. So Edgar Allan Poe was born in 1809. He's an American writer, poet, author, editor, literary critic, best known for his poetry and short stories, particularly his tales of mystery and the macabre. He is widely regarded as a central figure of Romanticism and Gothic fiction in the United States and of American literature. Poe was one of the country's earliest practitioners of the short story and is considered the inventor of the detective fiction genre, as well as a significant contributor in the emerging genre of science fiction. He is the first well-known American writer to earn a living through writing alone, but it resulted in a financially difficult life and career.
Poe might be one of the most he might be the most legendary American author of all time. Like other people came along, your
Yeah.
Hemingways and the people like that people point to.
I mean, I think you could make an argument for Poe. Absolutely.
I think he was that early author for America to like put America on the map. Uh,
1809 is when he was
yeah,
born. I mean,
in a time when I think Europe thought that they ran the show as far as art was concerned.
absolutely. Yeah. And what a lasting impression he's just made on the world of literature. So as a young boy, he was born to actors David and Elizabeth Poe. So his father, David, would abandon his family when Poe was when Edgar. I'm going to refer to him as Edgar because I want to just call him Poe, but like there's a lot of Poes in this story, so I need to be careful. His father, David, would would abandon his family when Edgar was only 1 year old. He was then raised by his mother, who was a traveling actor. He talks about having early memories of seeing her on stage, and when he talks about this later on in life, he refers to her as being like captivating and alluring, and how she would just like enthrall the audience, and she was this like otherworldly figure to him at a young age. But she would contract tuberculosis and die when he was just 3 years old, in which he would spend her illness at her bedside as just a small child. So he would watch his mother die, and then he would be orphaned. So he would go on to live with his foster parents, and that was John and Frances Allen. They would raise him to be a young gentleman. They gave him a good education. They taught him manners. They taught him. They nurtured his young like artistic leanings because he was immediately drawn to poetry. He was precocious. He was like this brilliant kid. And he loved his foster mother. His foster father was this tobacco merchant, and he was kind of distant. He was very severe. He, while providing for this upbringing, was not a particularly fond figure of a young Edgar's. So in his early years, he would develop a crush on this woman named Jane Stannard, who was an older woman. It was like a mother of like one of his friends. And he developed a crush on her. It was like his first ever crush. And then she died of brain cancer when he was 15 years old. So this other woman that he then developed a crush on, she dies, right?
Wow.
So another very tragic moment. He was said to go and like cry on her grave. Like he was that like taken with grief after she passed away. And then shortly after that, his foster mother herself would then also get tuberculosis, which they called consumption at the time. And while she was ill, his foster father, John, would start having affairs where he would actually like bring the women over to the house while Edgar was there. And he did not like that. He very much thought that, you know, women are to be revered and respected and all this stuff. And he was very romantic, and he did not approve of his father's infidelities. And his father at that point was fed up with him and sends him off to school. He's like, get out of here. You're going, you know, I'm going to send you to school so that you're not going to be bothering me. While in school, he got known for, I mean, he was like, first off, he was poor because when he got sent there, his father didn't give him any money. He was like, you're cut off. He went to the University of Virginia, and only its second year opened after it opened. It was brand new college.
Wow.
Right. And he's there. He has his room. He has this like dilapidated room that he draws all over. And apparently he's actually quite visually artistically talented as well. And people at the time were not sure whether he was going to end up becoming like a painter or a poet. But he decorated his room with his own drawings, and then he would welcome people over, and he would do readings of his work at the time to them. So he became known as this eccentric figure even on campus. His foster mother would shortly after die, 1829. She dies of tuberculosis. And now already at this point, he has lost two mother figures to tuberculosis and basically been abandoned by two fathers, as well as losing an early crush, right? And he would end up joining the army to kind of say screw you to his foster father. Like he's like, I can do this on my own. And he even wrote in a letter about how he's like, you're going to regret this because I'm going to become important. And, you know, I'm going to be someone that history will remember. And so he was definitely kind of out to say screw you to his foster father. And And obviously he did do that, right? He is definitely famous.
Hell of a motivator, I guess. Huh?
Yeah, yeah. He rose up the ranks in the army. He did well there. He went to West Point for a little while. So he was actually very athletic, even though he would downplay that later in life. Like he would talk about how like, oh, it was nothing, but like he was actually quite athletic in his youth. But at the same time, the romantic poet. At this time, he's trying to make a living writing, and he would self-publish a couple of books of poetry. Because at the time, like, publishing was still in its infancy. There was no copyright laws. These publishers would see a poor author like Poe, and they knew they could take advantage of him. So he had no leverage. So yeah, he was trying to make it as a writer, but it was not something he could do to make ends meet. So he was incredibly poor. He would publish The Telltale Heart in 1831, but the publisher told him it was too loud, and tone it down essentially. And because of that, they didn't pay him hardly anything for it.
Huh.
I saw kinds of different, like he was getting like $9 for stuff. Like he later sold the Raven. I think I saw $14 is what he got paid for the Raven. It was the only money he ever saw for it.
While reading the Raven, I was thinking a lot about like just the level of difficulty like that you introduce when you're rhyming, and the way that poetry is so rhythmic and repetitive in this way. And I was thinking like, man, like, did he write this in an afternoon? Because there's these famous stories about people who write it in an afternoon. But when I start thinking about poetry, and like, it's not very, very short. Like, it's not a haiku. It's not a couple stanzas. It's quite, I feel like in terms of a poem, it's fairly long. And it just got me thinking about like how difficult this is in a time when, I assumed he wasn't being paid well. For some reason, I remembered Poe being a figure that wasn't revered in his time, but you're saying that he was.
So he got famous a little bit, especially later in life, and especially after The Raven, which we'll get to. That brought him fame, but not money, because he didn't get paid well for it, and he would go around and do readings and stuff, but from what I was seeing, he wasn't getting paid for that either.
Got it. So yeah, just thinking about like how much you have to love the craft if you're not going to be, compensated well for it. And I guess it does bring him fame, but I don't know that he was seeking that out. So
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's just really impressive stuff.
Back to his personal life, because again, I think this is quite important. 1831, after the death of Frances, his foster mother, he is looking for somewhere to live, and he winds up contacting his Aunt Clem. His Aunt Clem is living with her 8-year-old daughter named Virginia in Baltimore, and he goes to live with them. While there, he is welcomed into the family, and he finally feels like he has like a stable living condition. Goes on to write The Telltale Heart, however. So all this time, he is writing really dark literature at the same time. So it's like, clearly he had demons throughout his entire life. I mean, he had been through a lot already.
Totally.
Right? Like, we're talking 1831. He was born in 1809, so he's 22 at this point where he goes to do this, goes to live with
And I
them.
remember this being the point in the story of Edgar Allan Poe that I'm like, man, really wish you didn't get with your like really young sister. I think right. That's how the story goes.
We're about to get into that.
Yeah.
So his cousin. So in 1834, he is summoned to John Allen's deathbed. So because his foster father John is now on his deathbed, where John threatens him with a cudgel from the deathbed and tells him that he will not be in the will and will not leave him a dime. So he is stricken from the will because they hate each other at this point. So that sounds like something right out of an Edgar Allan Poe story, right?
And while I'm thinking about it, that's a great thing to note, is that every time it's just the narrator or this or that in his stories, I'm always assuming and inserting Poe personally. Like I'm envisioning Edgar Allan Poe as the narrator in both The Fall of the House of Usher and The Raven. I just assumed that it's a Poe insert.
It's like kind of like a version of him. I think that's kind of safe to say, honestly, since usually they're unnamed. So in 1835, he would become an editor of the Southern Literary Messenger, which was kind of a new publication at the time. But he butted heads with his bosses. He was a difficult person to work with, from what I understand. But he earned a nickname as the Tomahawk Man because he would have these brutal reviews where he would review like the popular authors at the time and just be scathing. And he was like called the Hatchet Man. Like he just was brutal in his criticism of other authors. And this would actually become important later too, where like he made a lot of enemies with a lot of the most famous authors at the time. picked fights with them, even like accused Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of being a plagiarist, which like pissed off a lot of people because that was like a beloved figure at the time.
Wow.
Very combative. Now when he's like living somewhere else at this time, so he had lived with his aunt for a few years, and then he moved when he got this job as an editor. But while he's at this job, he gets a letter from his aunt, and she says that his cousin Virginia, age 12, is going to be sent to another household with this other guy, and then the idea is that he will live with this other family and perhaps marry at some point into this other family.
Virginia Wood, you're saying, right?
Virginia Wood.
Okay.
Edgar loses it at this. He writes this like letter where he's like, I'm writing through tears. I'm so upset. And he's like addressing Virginia directly. He's like, you need to make this decision for yourself. In it, he calls her his sister, his cousin, and his wifey. All this
stuff.
Did
he coin the term wifey?
I don't know. It was in the letter though, like direct quote. He's like profusely talking about how much he adores her and how, they basically are meant to be together. And because of this, he is able to talk his Aunt Clem out of it. And instead, he and his cousin are married when he is 26 years old and she is 12, almost 13. They knew this was bad because they forged her age 21 on the marriage certificate.
Gross.
Because they knew it would have been a scandal.
Yeah, it's disgusting. Otherwise, like somebody who I really like, I remember that being something that I learned about, and I was like, oof, not great.
So, this is an important part of his story, and I want to give it the view that I got because I watched a couple of documentaries about Edgar Allan Poe, and they were given by his biographers, and you could tell that these guys really wanted to cast this as not being as bad as it seems. Sure. And here was some of their reasoning, and then we could talk about what we may not believe. But they said that their relationship was mysterious. It was said to be much more of a brother-sister relationship. His love for her seemed to be in the way that he loved a lot of women, and that he would like revere them as angels. It would be like they were his muse. They were his reason for living. He really definitely saw women as like another, species. It was like, oh, women, they're all angels, and they were there for him to worship. So he worshipped her in that way, and supposedly some of his friends claimed that the relationship was not sexual until like maybe much later in the marriage. But nobody has any proof of that. It's just what people say. Right. And was that they're just them trying to save face, convince themselves? I don't know. Supposedly they had a very loving relationship. He would teach her, like he would play they would play together on the piano, go for long walks together, madly devoted to one another. She would write poetry about Poe himself, like Edgar himself. There's all this stuff that shows that their relationship was this like romance, right? But of course, underneath all of that, she was quite young. And even if you try and say it wasn't sexual, there's no proof of that. And I would also say a lot of his work deals with guilt, and like a gnawing guilt that causes madness in you. And one wonders if he might have felt a little bit guilty about this situation, even as he, sought it out.
I'm sure he was conflicted about it. I don't think it makes it much better in my modern perspective. I just, it's just a red flag to me for a person like that. It sounds like she would be married off fairly young also to this other family. So maybe he felt
unclear like when they would have actually gotten married, but that was the plan, was for her to get married to this
so
other
maybe
family,
he thought that he was saving her from a certain fate, and maybe it was not weirdly sexual until they did love each other.
Some people claim that he might have been asexual, but I don't see a lot of evidence of that. He was a lot of courtships with other women. Yeah. Again, it's just, it's hard because it was so long ago, right? We're basing this off of all these accounts that the people who wrote them are long dead. So who knows?
Yeah. I guess just take everything with a grain of salt and realize that,
absolutely. I mean, I kind of assume
probably not great.
Yeah. We're hearing the best, most sanitized version of this probably at this point. So 1835, he marries Virginia. They would have about 6 years of wedded bliss before one day she is playing the piano and stops to cough and when she does, she coughs up a spot of blood, which is something that he has seen twice before in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, she came down with tuberculosis at age 19.
Yeah.
And she would live for 5 years in terrible health. The fact that she lived 5 years is credited to the fact that she was so young and vivacious. But during that whole time, Poe would write some of his like most notable works. But this is like during the protracted death of his beloved wife, who he was clearly just madly in love with. Like that, however you feel about it,
Sure.
he was. And
Mm-hmm.
that fueled a lot of his writings at the time. The Raven, which would be published in 1845, I believe was written while she was still alive, but he was writing it as sort of a projection of his mental state. And he's sort of, this character that he's writing is mourning this loss of Lenore. And that's his way of working through it. And I think he was sort of projecting out like how mad he was going to become. The other thing he's doing is picking fights with these people. Apparently, he also like got into a fist fight with a fellow author. He was all over the place. Oh, he gets a meeting with the president of the United States because he's going to try and get a job in government.
Huh.
And he shows up to the meeting drunk and his like cloak's on inside out, and like the president's son sees this and like sends him away. And he's like, no, you're not going to go see the president like this. Come back when you're sober. Sends him away. He comes back later and he's like sober this time. But then when he meets the president, he like everything's going well. But then he tries to get him to subscribe to the magazine. He tries to convince him to buy subscriptions to the magazine. He's the editor of.
Oh yeah, man. Check out my SoundCloud.
Yeah, exactly. Like he just would self-sabotage in these moments. And it was like that didn't rub the president the right way. This was President John Tyler, by the way, which I know nothing about.
Yeah.
I mean, he's at all this time he's being described as someone who has fits of madness. He has obviously like all these bouts of alcoholism. There's some talk about while Virginia was ill that he actually had flirtatious relationship with another woman who was a poet, and Virginia like kind of encouraged it. Unclear whether or not she encouraged it because she felt that like she had a good effect on him. Like whenever she was around, he wouldn't drink. It seemed like Virginia was maybe worried about him drinking himself to death, and I think she knew she was going to die. Like she would talk about how she knew her death was imminent, so maybe she was hopeful that he would be able to move on with someone else who would be good for him, because it was clear at this point in his life that like he needed to have a woman that he was finding after to take care of him. That was like such a part of his life. That wouldn't work out with that other woman. And then Virginia would die in 1847, 5 years after the onset of the illness. During that time, he published The Raven, got $14 for it. It was something that would catapult him into fame. People started to call him the Raven. That became his new nickname. There was even a story about like children would like chase him around and like try and like mess with him and like call him Raven and all this stuff, and he would like turn around and be like nevermore, and they would all like go running away and stuff. Like so apparently he like really enjoyed it and like lived it up, and so he became kind of famous for this. He would give these lectures that at first were really renowned, but then later in his life became sort of infamous for him showing up drunk and being like incoherent and it being a mess.
And it seems like he's clearly dealing with some form of PTSD, right? Throughout his life, he's had all these scenarios.
Think about all
people
these
dying.
tragedies we've talked about, right?
And he's coping with alcohol.
Tuberculosis killed his mother, his foster mother, and now his like love of his life, all within not that long a time.
Yeah, terrible stuff. So you can definitely understand like where he is, just trauma wise. And then he's bandaging it with alcohol, and he turns into alcoholism.
Well, and opium.
I thought
and
famously
things,
there's like some opium abuse as well, right?
Yeah, I'd say opium seems to have been in there. The stuff I was reading didn't like outline at what point he became involved with that, but it seems to have been in the mix.
I thought there's stories of him like in ditches and this and that, and just disheveled and.
So we'll get there. Okay. After Virginia dies, he would live his most erratic few years. He would go and like lay himself on her gravesite and like cry himself to sleep and like sleep in the graveyard overnight. Like he would do that frequently. People would find him there.
Hmm.
He was that to a T, right? Like the most like romantic, gothic, emo guy.
Yeah.
This is him in his late 30s. But he did start courting several other women at the time. But there's some debate about whether or not any of this was actual romance, or if he just like wanted to, like he knew that he needed to be with somebody. Like he was courting this one woman who was like a rich poet who was like in high society, and their courtship went a long way. He even proposed to her and she accepted. But then her mother came to him and tried to get him to sign a document that said that if anything were to happen to her, he would not receive any of her estate or any of her money. And
She
this
thought he was like
infuriated
a
him so much that he called off the wedding. So they
okay.
didn't end up getting
Did
married.
she think based on his work that he might be like some sort of murderer or something?
Yeah, I
Is that
don't know.
wow?
Maybe. But definitely saw like maybe there was another motive going on here. Maybe it was something to do with her wealth. At the same time that he was courting her, he was also writing these letters to another married woman where he was like professing his love to her and saying that he's eagerly awaiting news of her husband's death, and stuff like that. It
Wow.
was and at the time this was his heaviest drinking. He was a mess. He lived in all these different locations. He kept moving to all these different little houses and cottages. They were poor throughout all of this, right? Like when he's living with Virginia, they're poor. They're living in a little cottage, didn't have much to their name. 1849 comes along. I believe that's the year. He's 40 years old, and he has now written his poem Annabel Lee, which was his like elegy and his pronouncement of love for Virginia. And he does it through this kind of fictional character Annabel Lee. But if you read that poem, it's about this heartbroken guy who's in love with Annabel Lee, who he compares to the angels, and he talks about how he wants to go and like sleep in her tomb by the seaside, and it's a very lovely poem. I remember really enjoying it, and it really, he was obsessed with this idea of like women and the people he loved and how they would die, and then like the mystery of death and what happens to us beyond the grave, and trying to pierce the veil. And he wanted to join them. He was very self-destructive in that way.
Yeah.
Often sick, often drunk, suffering bouts of insanity. He apparently told friends that he thought there were assassins after him. And this also gets into some of the mystery.
Paranoia.
So he was very paranoid. And then he goes to Virginia to tell his Aunt Clem about he's going to become engaged again to a woman that he like knew when he was 17. Her name's Elmira Shelton. He was going to tell Maria Clem, his aunt, about this. And apparently he's seen, and when people see him, he looks pale and sick. He does not look good. But he goes missing in the city for a few days. And then he's finally found in a ditch, semi-conscious. He's in Baltimore Street. And he's wearing somebody else's clothing. He's delirious. They take him to the hospital. Eventually he gets taken to the hospital. And while he's there, he's just like talking to, phantasms, they call it. And he's just like raving. Doesn't make hardly any sense at all. And supposedly his last words were, "God help my poor soul." And then he dies that day. It is a mystery what exactly caused his death. He again was found in this confused state. He was feverish and out of his mind a little bit, and unclear. The one of the prevailing theories that I've heard that I like, of course, I think there was an episode of BuzzFeed Unsolved where they actually talk about Edgar Allan Poe's death, and they go over some different options for what might have happened. So maybe I'll link that in the show notes. So if you want to hear some alternate possibilities, check that out. But one of my favorite ones was that he might have been the victim of what they called a political kidnapping, because it was election day, the day that he was found. And what would happen would be there were groups of these like thugs who would go around and they would kidnap people, drug them, beat them up, and then they would send them in to vote repeatedly and change their clothes between every time, and just compel them to do these multiple votes to try and get their guy elevated, whoever it was. And so the theory is that that would explain why he was wearing someone else's clothes and was so delirious and out of it, and that maybe he had been drugged and beaten and forced to do this.
I mean, horrific.
Which
Yeah.
there's some evidence that could have been the case.
Yeah. With the current political state and previous elections and people talking about multiple people voting multiple times and everything like that, it's just, I don't know, darkly funny to me. But at the same time,
like the history of this country and what was going on.
Yeah.
I don't remember what office the vote was for. Like, I didn't see that. I'm sure it's out there, but yeah, who knows?
People
Pretty
just
wild.
just don't, they want to, people want to cheat, it sounds like, cheat the system. But anyway, tragic that is such a, obviously tortured individual, but like an incredible artist, like once in a generation artist, dies like that in such a random way too. And maybe he was, you said he made a lot of enemies, who knows, like.
Yeah. And he talked about how there were assassins after him.
Yeah.
He used to tell people that, and then he would die like shortly thereafter in mysterious circumstances. So there's a lot of debate about what actually happened to him, and it's unknown. But I think that all of that gives us good context, and we can kind of look at this through, so we can start to contextualize when things were coming out and when these different works occurred and what he might have been, working through at the time.
Yeah. And we're going to, obviously next week, we're going to move into more of his work alongside that show. So it's cool that we'll get to talk about Poe more than just this episode.
Absolutely. It's going to be, throughout all of it. But first off, we're going to talk about the fall of the House of Usher, which is our titular story that the Flanagan adaptation takes its name from, and I think takes its sort of like overarching plot from. So we're going to talk about what happens in the story. We have not seen any of the show. So if this ends up spoiling anything from the show, it's only incidental in the fact that this is the plot of the short story that's been out for hundreds of years. So, our apologies on that, but we're just going to talk about the story and why it's important and what happens in it. I would like to actually read a little section from this because I think, Poe's writing is so beautiful. I wanted to give him some reads here. I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. And this is the arrival of that narrator, right? And he says, I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape, features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I cannot compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into the aught of the sublime. And this is the kind of stuff, like, he's so talented, clearly, as a writer. But he crafted these stories, and people say that this is one of the best examples where everything about this story, it's like a totalitarian, what was it called? Like, there was a total mastery of language and detail, and everything that he is describing plays into the themes and plays into the plot, and it plays into, like, it's all so wrought. And this became like very influential going forward for other writers. But this is about this narrator going to the House of Usher.
The story starts off, and very early on, you get the sense that the house and the actual legacy of the people, the family, are very tied together. And the way that he does that, I think, it makes it so that, like, whenever he's saying something, whether it's about the house or whether it's about the family, they're kind of one and the same. And I found that to be, like, so fascinating throughout. It's dilapidated, and then so are the residents, and they're like,
he talks about the vegetation is like sentient and
it's
like,
alive. Everything's
it's
alive.
out
The
to
house,
get him, and like
the every object, it's very cool in that way. I don't know if it's probably not the first haunted house story, but this being a pointing to haunted house stories and thinking about where they've come.
Yeah, the Haunting of Hill House.
Haunting of Hill House, among others. It's just so evocative of you can just see the influence that's there, and the way that he built, and then the dread that's there throughout. Like, this is a 200-year-old story roughly, and it still builds tension and dread in a super deliberate way. And maybe I definitely think that it can be difficult to read at times because of the nature of the prose.
But
Like he
rewarding too, right? Like if you take your time with it and like
Yeah, that's exactly it too. Is like if you take your time with it and really understand what the author's saying, and like you said, everything's so deliberate
yeah,
and done to for the story. Like it's like when we talk about scenes in film, like every single thing in frame was meticulously put there because in some way it's furthering the story, and that's what Poe is doing with his language here.
yeah,
And yeah, I just thought that the tie and the leading, as much as I kind of knew where this was going because of it being redone by other in ways being redone by other authors down the line, it was such a high degree of difficulty to keep me interested in it, and it did the whole way through. It's relatively short. It is a short
yeah.
story, but yeah, there's a couple twists and turns that I didn't see coming that we can talk about.
Yeah, so let's talk about. There's Roderick Usher. He is the sort of patriarch of this house, and and when the unnamed narrator shows up, he's learned that Roderick's sister Madeline has fallen ill, and they're twins apparently. There's some apparent references to the fact that their relationship might actually be an incestuous romantic relationship as well as being related. So there's some
Yeah,
debate about whether or not that
I
sort of sin is weighing upon the house, and Roderick is he's very guilty about the whole situation throughout. He himself is ill, and talks about it, or maybe he is also a hypochondriac and like he's not actually ill, but he's playing it up like he is. It's
yeah,
it's up for
and
debate.
in if we think of Poe as an insert here, you can start thinking about like maybe what he was feeling in terms of incestuous, like borderline
Yeah,
incestuous
so
relationships, and
that's what I was referencing earlier. This is 1839. He publishes this, so he's writing a little bit before that. This is after he's married Virginia, while they're still in their happy period of their marriage before she's actually come down with an illness. But this is a story about an incestuous potentially couple where the guilt and the attitude of Roderick towards Madeline, it kind of seems to be a self fulfilling prophecy, right? And how he's condemning his own home to ruin based off of the guilt he feels. And yeah, it's hard not to wonder if maybe there's a little bit of guilt being felt by Edgar here. And then the other thing I think that's worth noting is that this Roderick is like a wealthy, almost father-like figure, whose house has fallen to ruin. And this is also the time in which John is falling ill and like telling him he's not going to be in the will and all this stuff. So like there's potential influences there as well, I think.
yeah, I didn't pick up on incestuous vibes specifically between the two, but very weird and close. And then
Yeah,
the way that he mourns the sister is almost. I mean, of course, you would mourn in almost the same way that you would a lover, but he does mourn her in a really dramatic way.
yeah, very
That could
dramatic. He won't let her be buried anywhere typical because he's worried about her body being like stolen for by like doctors or something for like research, and apparently this was like a real concern at the time. As we've probably talked about in like the Mary Shelley Frankenstein coverage, like similar things were going on in America. So because of this, he wants to bury her in the tomb within the house itself. And they go down and like visit her in death, and they see her at one point, and like the narrator notes that her like cheeks are rosy, and she's almost described as if she's alive, right? And then we get this scene later where Roderick is overcome with guilt, and he's like losing it, and the narrator comes in and is like, let me try and calm you down by like telling you this story, and he starts reciting to him this poem. But during that, Roderick's raving about how she's actually alive and that they buried her alive in the tomb, his sister. And the narrator's like, no, that can't be the case. But then they start hearing these noises while they're like, he's
yeah.
like reading him this poem of like, sounds like something coming out of a tomb, and it sounds like something walking down the halls, and
Well, and
yeah,
while we're talking about that, I wanted to ask you, like, obviously, for the dual effect of like, this figure, I forget his name right now, is fighting a dragon in this medieval
yeah.
story,
I don't remember
and
the name either. Yeah,
I have to think that like outside of the fact that like there's correlations between the sounds and some of the things that are going on, like a house, but like the dragon, I feel like has to represent some thing that they're fighting to overcome, and I feel like it's a metaphor for maybe something that the Usher house, like some failing on their part or something that they
yeah.
did. I couldn't really put together exactly what I felt like the dragon meant in that story. because like slaying a dragon to
Yeah.
get this shield, and then the shield falls to the ground, all that stuff. um I felt like there was something about, some
Well, it's also like
foul deeds or
I
something.
do I do think there absolutely is that. I can't like spell it out for you because again I'm not like super familiar with the history of that poem, but I think there is definitely a lot of also correlations between like fighting a monster and there being a monster in theory like coming for you, and the sounds of the story are like reflected in the sounds they're actually hearing. Like whenever there would be some dramatic moment in the poem, they would hear a sound. So there's this creeping dread as something's coming into the room,
Yeah.
and then the door flies open and it's Madeline, and she's covered in blood, and she's like crawled her way out of the crypt, and she like jumps onto Roderick.
All the noises were her, like all the things that they're
Yeah. Oh
hearing
yeah.
that were, yeah, her trying to get out of the tomb, screeching and clawing and banging, that kind of stuff.
Well, and that was another big fear at the time. So he's writing like apparently he writes a lot about this. We'll circle back to this, but he writes a lot about being buried alive, and like this was a big fear at the time. And they had those bells that like they would
Yeah.
attach so that if you were buried alive, you could like ring them to let people know.
Yeah.
I don't know how often it actually happened that people were buried alive, but it was definitely a big fear that people had, that people would pronounce them dead, bury them, and then they'd wake up in a coffin underground.
Yeah. Well,
And so he's
there's,
playing with like a very common fear also here as he's doing all of this.
yeah, and this correlates a little bit with the cask story that we get in a little bit. Another
Yeah.
buried alive situation.
Yeah. Our narrator flees the house, and then he's looking back at the house, and the house like splits open and collapses and falls into the lake.
Hmm.
And like a really like kind of magical moment, honestly. And it also brings that together of like everything about this house was connected to these characters, and the house represented the fall itself and the fracturing of it.
Yep.
And it goes back to that whole idea that like the vegetation was sentient and like all this stuff, like it like pulls it into the lake. I don't know.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's how this one ends.
The house is also repeatedly talked about as a character, like the eyes
Yeah.
of the house, and there was like a fissure in it that eventually got
Hmm.
larger as like seemingly as the family got closer to ruin, so did the house in that way.
There's a couple of other figures there that I'm not sure what happens to them, but there was like the house doctor, like our physician was there. There was some servants at times, so it was like clearly they were this like wealthy family who had fallen on hard times too. Like they had lost a lot of their fortune, which is another repeated thing we see in a lot of like people losing their fortune and then losing their minds over it.
Do you think that as our character Roderick was spiraling, do you think that he knew that he was like, did he want to bury her alive? You know what I mean? Like what happened there? Why did he bury her alive and then say, "Oh my God, we buried her alive"? I know he said eventually he could hear things in the house, and that's why he thought that they had.
I don't know. It's this weird self-fulfilling prophecy where like he was predicting that she was going to die, and then she falls ill, and then he decides to bury her in the tomb. Yeah, it's like why do that if you're not sure? But maybe he was sure, because I guess the open question is, does she come back as some sort of zombie? Does she come back as some sort of animated corpse?
Yeah.
And this is a manifestation of the guilt, and it's like a revenge from the grave on, because the idea here is also that like Roderick failed her, and like his loss of fortune led to the fall of the house, which led to her illness, which led to everything. So he is culpable for this, which is something that Edgar Allan Poe would feel a lot of guilt about in his life, was his inability to provide for Virginia and for himself and for the people he loved, because again he was poor throughout his life, so he often felt this guilt of like, I can't provide for them, I'm failing them, and that I think manifests here a little bit too.
Yeah. Just one more thing to mention here: the way that at one point the narrator mentions like the people of the town see the family and the house as one and the same as well. The way that they're
Yeah.
tied together in that way. I think it's like a perception thing too. Like their reputation
Sure.
is sullied. So, and that's part of the falling of the house.
And so this is also what the like titular story is for all of Flanagan's adaptation here. So what an interesting one to like,
Yeah.
couch this as. And I've seen a trailer, so I know that it has to deal with the Usher family. There's like multiple members, and they're all gathered around. And clearly, this is going to be a tragic tale about the fall. That's in the title of the story. So it's a very interesting one for him to sort of set this all into. And I'm going to be really curious to see how he keeps coming back to this original story, but then also delves into all these other mini stories that we're going to get into in future episodes.
It's a really brilliant idea and a cool way to get to address a lot of Poe's work and kind of have all the
Yeah, it's like he's
characters.
doing this Edgar Allan Poe adaptation that kind of like synthesizes it all together. It's a
Yeah.
very neat idea. I like it.
I'm excited, and I've seen the cast. I haven't even seen a trailer, but
Yeah.
of the Flanagan stuff. Like, there's been one or two things here that haven't hit super squarely, but everything else I've been really happy with. And come this time of year, if we can expect like a Flanagan thing around October every 2 years or so, I'll take it, man. I'm a big fan. I
Clearly
really
a big
enjoy
name in
having it.
horror right now. Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into The Raven. We got to talk about The Raven. This is Poe's most famous piece of work, I think. This is the thing that put him on the map. The Baltimore Ravens are named after this poem. This is very famous.
So he was a Baltimore resident, I guess, at some point or another.
At times, that's where he died. He at times lived there. He lived in a bunch of different houses over the years. But yeah, that's where they got their name from. They're literally, it was like a fan voted name when they got their team, and a lot of like Baltimore residents voted for the Raven based off of Edgar Allan Poe.
They were the Baltimore Colts for a long time either also, but we don't have time to get into the NFL history, but yeah, it is cool. I mean, like,
whenever
if
they
there's
adopted the name the Ravens, I guess.
well, once Baltimore Colts left town to Indianapolis, there's a whole thing about it.
Yeah, so it was like
they
a new
abandoned
team,
the town.
right? When they got a new team.
Right, when they got a new team, they then voted on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the coolest namesakes you could have, right? Like something that has like a history to it, rather than just like a random name like
I've
the
always thought it
Lions.
was a rad name for a football
Or-
team.
Yeah, it's a super cool name.
This is such a cool story, right? And it is a story. It's a story and a poem.
Yeah.
It's this highly lyrical, highly rhythmic, very meticulously crafted story, and yet it does tell a story of this raven shows up saying nevermore, and early on, our narrator even says like, I can't tell if this nevermore is just something that it just says and doesn't mean anything. That's probably what it is, right? Like he recognizes, like, it just probably says nevermore. That's probably the only word it knows.
Right. I have so much to say about this story. This is my favorite story so far, and with my memory of Poe, which is, I haven't read him in a long time, I think this might be my favorite Poe works, especially right now. I'm just so into it.
So basic, James.
I know, but I love the way.
But like, honestly, that's kind of the legacy of the Raven, is that it is like, it got so popular. All of the poets at the time weighed in on it. William Butler Yeats came out and called it an insincere and vulgar, an execution of a rhythmical trick. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "I see nothing in it." Like, there were other poets out there just like blasting this thing.
Well, he
because
probably blasted
it
them
became
first.
hugely popular. Like, the average person liked this poem, whereas a lot of other poetry seemed to be designed for the elites out there, right? Like, this was designed to be broadly appealing, and it was. So we're talking about like popular fiction over time and popular poetry.
Yeah.
It's also gotten this, I think it's dismissed by a lot of modern like poets and a lot of modern criticism as being just like, oh, it's so rhythmic and it's so lyrical and it's so like obviously like crafted in a way that of course everybody loves it. Like, let's move on. Let's all talk about a different poem. We're all over
Sure.
The Raven.
And honestly, that's how I felt about it going into reading The Raven. My memory of it was like, okay, yeah. It's like, I know exactly what it is. But for some reason, reading it this time, I got more out of it. And whether I don't necessarily think it's the most clever or like lyrically clever or anything like that. It is repetitive and it is.
I'm saying all of that to play devil's advocate. I love The Raven, man. I say fuck all that. This is a great poem.
I'm just trying to say, like, I don't think that the reason I love it is how complex it is. I love it for other reasons. But this idea of like man's interpretation on guilt and loss and everything like that. But the way that you can project something onto any situation. And in this situation, it's one of the worst situations you can go through. And something that's very close to Poe, clearly. We've talked about like the death of many people in his life. But man, is it cool. Like when you start thinking about like threading in things like Norse mythology and Roman mythology into this story with like the idea of like a messenger raven and everything that he's saying, it's saying nevermore to, and he's taking that as like a sign.
It's so funny because he's, like I said, he starts the poem off going like, oh, he just says that, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And then he has a protracted conversation and he starts getting angry with it as it keeps saying nevermore, and he's like taking it to be like an actual answer. And that's the thing that Poe does so well, where like clearly his characters are like going mad as we're reading about them. And they sometimes are aware of it, they're sometimes not. Like the Telltale Heart, which we'll get to. I always loved how in that story the narrator of that is like, I'm not mad. Let me tell you how calmly and how meticulously I planned this. Like, there's nothing mad about this. As he goes on to describe, like dismembering somebody and then like losing his mind over guilt of it. So cool. And like the opening of this poem, one of the most iconic openings to like anything ever.
Easily,
I
yeah.
have to read it. So once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this and nothing more." And it goes on, right? In this, you can tell like how lyrical and rhythmic this is, and there's so much alliteration. It's
Hmm.
almost sing-songy,
Yep.
but he's doing all of this, and at the same time it's so atmospheric and it's so gothic and dark, and it's a raven, and it's midnight dreary. Like, it becomes one of the most evocative poems I think of all time because of that, and also most like Halloween specific ones.
Yeah. I mean, just a universal thing that people go through is loss too. And so like this is a character who's lost someone, and then
Yeah,
the wishful thinking of someone knocking at your door and what that means. And then as it goes on, he is basically like damning himself. He's like, will I meet Lenore again in the afterlife? Nevermore. Will I this and
yeah.
that?
So
And so
let me read that line, that because that's towards the end of the poem, and I think a turning point, honestly, in the poem, where he's like he's built this up, and he wants to forget about Lenore, but he also desperately wants to remember. And then this, in that way that Poe does so well, where it's like both things are true.
right.
And finally he's like convinced himself, like, fine, you're a prophet. You are sent from the underworld. You're here to tell me something. He says, "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels call Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore." And that's like the turn where he's like, "No, I'm not ever going to get to see her again. Like, even at, in heaven, he'll be, forbidden his Lenore." And then that's where he's like, "Get out of here, you raven! I hate you," And but then it's still there tapping at his chamber door, like it like lives on in the shadow and all this stuff. Like, it's creepy.
And the way that the raven isn't meant to be necessarily physically there too. It's like this is
Or
an
it is.
expression, or both.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it could all be a metaphor, or it could
Yeah,
just be a raven that's saying a word, like he says at the start of the poem, that doesn't mean
right.
anything, and all the meaning he's giving to it is his own creation.
Or both, which is definitely is both.
Yeah,
But so the end here, he's like in the shadow of the raven's tapping on his door basically forever,
yeah.
meant to say like, yes, you will deal with this forever. And it's like kind of that dark look at, this is something that everyone will deal with and something that everyone will go
And the
through.
idea of it tapping, right? Like it's a nuisance. It's always there. It's bothering you. It won't leave you alone. And
Yeah.
that I love that too. Of like it's not just like a gentle melancholy. It's a thing in your life that is going to drive you mad, and it does here.
The other thing I love is, the story starts out tapping on the door. He opens it, nothing's there. And he's like, you know, is this my beloved? Is this Lenore? And
Yeah.
then he closes it, comes back to the tapping on the door again, and then he sees the raven. And then he pulls up a chair and just sits down with the raven, and he's just chilling, thinking it's this amazing, like, speaking raven. And it just has such a fun beginning, and then it just like it just gut punches you as it goes on. And when you start thinking about like whether it is really there, and then another interesting side to it is, if it is really there, is it sent by some demonic presence? Is it sent by some godly presence, whatever, or
Yeah.
is it just a bird saying nevermore because it heard its previous owner was
Yeah.
had
And
this
this
horrible
perfectly
fate?
encapsulates so many of the themes that we're going to see in so many of these stories, where it's like a character who is so guilty and so heartbroken that he is being driven mad by those emotions, and those that madness is manifesting in some way. Like, this is the kind of stuff we'll see time and again in Poe's work as we go forward.
Yeah,
So cool. We
legendary
got to move
story.
on to the last one here so we can get to our last story, though. All right, so the Cask of Amontillado. This is another very, very famous story because of its depiction of this murder. And this is another thing that Poe is famous for. He writes these stories from the point of view of the killer. This narrator is like calmly taking his friend, his supposed friend Fortunato, and he takes them from there's like some sort of revelry going on. He's out in the street and he's got bells and he's got, he's been having a good time. He's kind of drunk, and he comes up to him and he's like, I got this wine, this Cask of Amontillado, and I know you love wine. Let's go see this thing. It's down in my like basement vaults. That's where I keep the wine. And so he's like, all right, let's go. And the whole time they're walking, Fortunato's like doing these little digs at him, right? Like he's talking about like, oh, there's like a line where about how you formerly used to be, rich and important, and you're not so much now. And we get the sense that they aren't really very good friends. And our narrator clearly has something out for him. And I'll read a little bit from this story here too. He says, "The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled. But the very definitiveness with which it is resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong." So that's very twisty and kind of like, what is even being said here? But basically it's like, I am going to get back on him, and I got to get back on him with impunity. And it's going to be a big act of vengeance because this was a big insult. And to do anything less than that is like, a failure. And you're like, okay, well, how big of a revenge are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's kind of what he lulls you into, because it's a narrator, because you're in the perspective of a character like this. You assume that they have good intentions. You assume that you're on their side, and as the story goes on, you're like, man, this guy, yeah, he maybe he's gonna trick him with the wine or something like that. Something's gonna happen here. But as it travels, and again, I hadn't read the story. I wasn't even aware of like what the ending was gonna be. And so I'm like, oh, this guy's dressed like a clown or dressed like a jester, basically.
Yep.
And this carnival experience. It seems like everybody's having fun, and then you get that the guy is a little unhinged. The narrator, what's his name,
Montresor.
Montresor. He seems like he's like, oh, he told his staff at his home that they could go, they needed to stay there, which he knew would send them off into the festivities. And so you're like, okay, he's kind of cunning and conniving, like something's going on here.
This is all planned. This is all very meticulously planned.
And it builds
Fortunato
up.
At the same time, I think it's interesting to note, Montresor keeps saying like, oh, you're such an aficionado, your taste is so great and is so refined, like you have to be the one to come tell me if this is a true Cask of Amontillado. And Fortunato like is taking this like fancy wine that he gives him. He's like, let's drink this wine while we're on our way down. And he takes it and he's just like pouring it back and chugging it, which is an interesting like counterpoint to the idea of him being like an aficionado, right?
Well,
he's
not
clearly
enjoying
it. He's not like, he's just like he's just drunk at this point.
Yeah.
So maybe this is all just like him also buttering him up, like, oh, you have such fine taste, but maybe the guy doesn't really.
I think it definitely is that. I think that he maybe is like a brash character, a brash person who stepped over a line without even necessarily realizing it. He may have this person's clearly insane. By the end, we know that our main character is insane. My theory on this is that this character, Fortunato, did something to slight this person without even realizing it, and then this person is just so unhinged. Montresor.
Yeah. There's some talk of like the Freemasons, I think, and he's like, are you a member of the Masons? And he's like, he's very insulting to him about like how he shouldn't be a member, and I forget exactly how it goes down, but this is like one of the last things that Fortunato is saying as they're arriving at this spot. I mean, basically he's like, here, come take a look at this with me. And he goes to take a look, and then he just like, there's some manacles in there. He binds him into this thing, and he's in this like hole in the wall, shoves him in there. He gets clasped to the wall, chained, and then slowly Montresor just starts getting out the mortar, getting out the trowel, and he starts like bricking him up into the
He's like, "Oh,
wall.
you don't think I should be in the Masons, huh?" And he's like, "Check me
Yeah.
out. I'm stone. I'm out here with a bunch of stone."
During this time, Fortunato starts to like sober up, and he's like, "Haha, good joke, my friend. One day we will look back at this with delight, and we will laugh about this moment." And he's like slowly bricking him up till like the last brick is there, and he's like looking in, like, "Oh, okay, yeah, you think this is a joke, do you?"
Yeah.
And he's calling out to him, and our main character's just like, "Yeah, fuck, this is all part of my revenge." Closes him in. And then we hear that like his body's been there like 50 years later, so like
That's
not
the big
ever
reveal.
found,
Yeah,
right?
it's like
Yeah,
50 years on. He's recounting the story to himself, almost like a serial killer would, like
yeah,
remember his kills or something.
yeah. So I mean, deep fear, right, of just being bricked up in a wall and left. Like that's again
Yeah.
that idea of entombment is something that we'll see him come back to over and over again.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm not like a literary historian or anything, but I am curious, like how often perspectives from an somebody evil, were done. I wonder if Poe
Yeah,
was doing
I
something
have to
pretty
imagine
cutting
this was
edge.
pretty
Yeah,
new for the time, pretty
taboo,
shocking for people,
probably.
taboo, absolutely. Like, yeah, it's just to read about heroic figures, not villains who are like losing their minds as you're reading them.
Yeah, and for those reasons, I think it's a really interesting story. Probably pushing the envelope for
Yeah.
that time period.
So I think this is a really cool story. It's one of his most famous. This is one we've heard is also very influential in the story, or in the adaptation we're about to watch. So I'm like curious if we're going to see somebody get bricked up on a wall at some point. But I love that there's also some backstory to this that gives it an interesting context. So the theory goes that Poe wrote this tale as a response to a personal rival, Thomas Dunn English. So Poe and English had had several confrontations, usually revolving around literary caricatures of one another. Poe thought that one of English's writings went a bit too far and successfully sued the other man's editors for libel in 1846. So English had published a revenge-based novel in 1844 called The Power of SF. The plot was so convoluted and difficult to follow, but made references to secret societies and ultimately had a main theme of revenge. It included a character named Marmaduke Hammerhead, who was a famous author called the Black Crow, who uses phrases like nevermore and lost Lenore, which refers to Poe's poem The Raven. This parody of Poe was depicted as a drunkard, a liar, and an abusive lover. So he publishes this novel in which there's this character, right? And Poe's like, fuck you. So he writes this story, writes the Cask of Amontillado, and apparently Fortunato and the reference to the Secret Society of Masons was also a reference to this novel and like how it had been all about the Masons.
Hmm.
And yeah, this
So
this idea of the character who was like a supposed friend or supposed like someone who is like, oh, your taste is so good, everyone talks about how you're so great at your wine tasting, right? And if you take that out to be like literary taste and
sure.
taste as a writer, and bricks him up in a wall, leaves him for dead.
I mean, that kind of a threat at some point, like
I'm telling you, man, this is how this guy was. He was
I'll
like,
fucking
he
put
had
you in a
picked fights
wall.
with everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I like it more for that reason. I think it's
Yeah.
a little unhinged and a little mean, but it sounds
And
like
well, it's also like, yeah, it's
coming
like
back and forth.
like you don't know who you're fucking with.
Yeah.
I will brick you into a wall. I'm that insane.
Yeah, I think recontextualize, because I kept talking about the other two stories as Poe insert stories. So now that I have that information, like recontextualizing this is a Poe insert story as well. Like,
Yeah.
The character's so meticulous and cunning and planned the whole thing.
And just
Yeah.
merciless, right? Like he doesn't care when the other guy's like saying, get me out of here. We'll laugh
Yeah.
about this one day. He's like, no, this is all part of my revenge.
He dressed the other character in a gesture. He's like, "You're a fucking
Yep.
joke to me. You're
Oh,
a jester."
yeah, the guy was kind of a fool throughout, right? Like he was not depicted in a flattering way.
Right.
So yeah, I thought that was a fun little backstory, because I think the story obviously still works on its own, but like having that backstory definitely gives some fun context for this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is where we're gonna have to leave this episode. I am going to be at World Fantasy next week, and I'm going to be moderating a panel that is about the legacy of Stephen King.
Awesome.
So should be super cool. If you're
Yeah,
gonna be
really
at World
cool.
Fantasy by chance in Kansas City, come check it out. Should be fun. Looking forward to that. But like, yeah, this is where we're gonna leave this one for now. I'm excited to get into the actual adaptation. See where Flanagan takes all of this. But I feel like this is a really good foundation for us to build on now as we go into the show.
Yeah, I'm really excited and have been anticipating the show for a while. So really excited to get into that, see what Flanagan's going to do with it, and then read more Poe. We're going to read more Poe as we get more into the show. What are you going to do, by the way, if in the audience there's a wild Stephen King just happened to be in the audience of your panel?
Yeah, at World Fantasy in Kansas City. Somehow I doubt it. But if you enjoyed this episode, you enjoyed our coverage of Edgar Allan Poe, let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. And if you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. Let us know in the comments. We love to talk with people in there. I'm excited for this one, so I hope other people are as well.
And make sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, TikTok, all the places. And, send us a message on there. Make sure you're following, like the videos on YouTube, all that good stuff.
And if you'd like to support us another way, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm, and you can get access to our bonus episodes, which we will be recording a new one very soon, where I'm going to be talking about my current situation in my querying my novel and where I'm at with that and some recent things that have happened there. So if you're curious about that, check us out on Patreon. It's for as little as $2, you can get all kinds of bonus content.
Thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, well, happy Halloween, everyone. Hopefully you're enjoying the season as much as we are. And until next time,
keep adapting.